In example 4, we are going to go through how to graph cotangent function. It says describe how the graphs of f of x equals cotangent of x and g of x equals 3 over 2 cotangent of x minus 3 pi over 2 are related, and graph g of x. One thing we should note is that we have this 3 over 2 in front, which is our amplitude. And so since 3 over 2 is bigger than 1, we know that it's going to be stretched vertically. So we can say it's stretched vertically by a factor of 3 over 2. And then we also should note that we have this c value here, so that's going to affect our phase shift. And so our phase shift, just like in our sine and our cosine functions, is the opposite of c divided by b. In this case, our c value is negative 3 pi over 2, and our b value is just 1. So if we take the opposite of it, it becomes a positive 3 pi over 2. Dividing it by 1 won't change that. So since it's positive, it means that we're shifting to the right. And so we are also shifting to the right by 3 pi over 2. Remember that the period of cotangent is pi, and the cotangent is cosine over sine. Two consecutive vertical asymptotes used most often for the cotangent function are x equals 0 and x equals pi. Remember, the tangent was negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. Our cotangent is going to be 0 and pi. So as we fill out our first box, just our original cotangent function, we're looking for our x values to start with our asymptotes and end with our asymptote. So in one full period, we go from 0 to pi. Directly in the middle of 0 and pi is going to be pi over 2. In between 0 and pi over 2, directly in the middle, would be pi over 4. And in between pi over 2 and pi would be 3 pi over 4. Then what we want to do is evaluate the cosine at these functions. So the cosine of 0, using that unit circle, cosine of 0 is 1. Cosine of pi over 4 is the square root of 2 over 2. The cosine of pi over 2 is 0. The cosine of 3 pi over 4 is negative square root of 2 over 2. And the cosine of pi is negative 1. If you have questions how to get any of these, please let me know. And again, we're using the unit circle to figure those out. Then we want to do the sine. So sine of 0 is 0. The sine of pi over 4 is the square root of 2 over 2. The sine of pi over 2 is 1. Sine of 3 pi over 4 is square root of 2 over 2. And the sine of pi is 0. To get the cotangent, we're dividing the cosine by the sine. 1 divided by 0 is undefined. Then we have square root of 2 over 2 divided by square root of 2 over 2, which is 1. 0 divided by 1 is 0. Negative square root of 2 over 2 divided by square root of 2 over 2 is going to be negative 1. And finally, we have negative 1 divided by 0, which is undefined. And then what we're going to do over here on the right, remember we're always taking that bx minus c part. This part right here is where we start with our main points. So we have our points that we're going to use for our cotangent function, which are 0, pi over 4, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, and pi. And those values that we're using here, and here's our cotangent function with it. So that goes in here, which is undefined. And these will be the same in every time you graph it. Then what we have to do is figure out what the x values we have after that shift has taken place. So we're going to do what we did before and take this x minus 3 pi over 2 and set it equal to each one of these. So we're going to take x minus 3 pi over 2, set it equal to 0. So if we add 3 pi over 2 to both sides, we get x is equal to 3 pi over 2. And then we'll take x minus 3 pi over 2, and set it equal to pi over 4. So then if we add 3 pi over 2 to both sides, we have x equal to pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 2. And we need common denominators in order to add these. So I'm going to multiply to get to 4. I have to multiply by 2. So this is going to become a 4. If I multiply the top by 2, then that's going to become a 6. So basically I'm adding 6 pi over 4 with pi over 4. And I get x equal to 7 pi over 4. Then I'm going to take x minus 3 pi over 2, and I'm going to set it equal to pi over 2. So if I add 3 pi over 2 to both sides, I get x equal to pi over 2 plus 3 pi over 2, which is going to be 4 pi over 2, or 2 pi. Then I'm going to take my x minus 3 pi over 2 and set it equal to 3 pi over 4. So x is going to equal 3 pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 2. Now remember, I need that in terms of fourths, so just like before, this would be 6 pi over 4. So I'm going to get 9 pi over 4. And then the last one, I need to take that x minus 3 pi over 2 and set it equal to pi. So x is going to be pi plus 3 pi over 2, which would be the same thing as 2 over 2. So 2 pi over 2 plus 3 pi over 2 would give me 5 pi over 2. Then if I go back and look at my function here, this 3 over 2, this amplitude part, that gets multiplied by all my cotangent functions here. Remembering my undefineds will not change. So this stays undefined. That's my asymptote. 3 over 2 times 1 is 3 over 2. 3 over 2 times 0 will give me 0. 3 over 2 times negative 1 is negative 3 over 2. And then my undefined. And from here, we'll go ahead and graph it. So the first thing we have to do is set up our table, or our graph, I guess. So let's grab our graph. And the asymptotes that we're starting with are 3 pi over 2 and 5 pi over 2. But one thing I want you to be aware of is how much we're going up by each time. To figure out how much we're going up by each time, we're going to be taking a look up here. And taking a look from our x's, we're going from 3 pi over 2 to 7 pi over 4 to 2 pi to 9 pi over 4 and so forth. To figure that out, we can subtract 7 pi over 4 minus 3 pi over 2. You could take 2 pi, subtract 7 pi over 4, and when you do that subtraction, you should see that you have a difference of 1 pi over 4. If you don't see that difference or you don't know how to subtract 7 pi over 4 minus 3 pi over 2, let me know and I can help you along. But what that tells us is that we are going up by a factor of pi over 4, and we need to be consistent with that from 0 all the way up to where we need to be. So as we start labeling our axes, we are starting with 1 pi over 4. So here is pi over 4, and then we're counting up by pi over 4. So 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4 is the same as pi over 2, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4 is the same thing as pi, then 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4 is the same as 3 pi over 2, 7 pi over 4, 8 pi over 4 is the same as 2 pi, 9 pi over 4, and 10 pi over 4 is the same as 5 pi over 2, once you simplify those down. And the highest we're going up is 1.5. So if we label this as 1, here's 2, 1.5 is going to fall somewhere right in the middle. And we can do that in the other direction as well. Here's negative 1 and negative 2. If we take a look back at our chart on the top, our asymptotes are at 3 pi over 2 and 5 pi over 2. So we're going to come back down here and we're going to put our asymptotes in at 3 pi over 2 and 5 pi over 2. And then we have, if you look back at it, we have the point 7 pi over 4, 3 halves. So 7 pi over 4, about 1.5. And then we have the point 2 pi and 0. So we're right here. And then finally 9 pi over 4 is negative 1.5. So we're right here. And our cotangent graph is going to start up and then come down, riding along those asymptotes. If you have questions, please let me know.